Hello and welcome to another episode in our usual broadcast. Of course, tonight we have Wade Fransson, our usual host, who is a former minister, and he's going to be approaching this conversation from a Bible-based theological approach. And then, of course, we have our guest from last week, Daniel Sanderson, who is going to be approaching this conversation from a philosophical approach, especially a data-driven, philosophical, and potentially theological angle. And so, gentlemen, I turn it over to you to continue the conversation from last week. Those that did not have the opportunity to join us last week, please pause this video and go watch last week's episode, which will catch you up. And then, of course, we encourage you to like and subscribe, and so that way you get notifications about each of the episodes. For those of you that are joining us for our first time, we're here every Tuesday at 8 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. Central, and we do encourage you to like and subscribe and hit that bell icon so that you can get notifications about when we go live in the future. So, with that being said, over to you, gentlemen, to kick it off.
Well, I'd like to thank the disembodied voice of Alex here and let everyone know that Alex experienced the vagaries of weather and his house sprung a leak. So that's why he was gracious enough to still begin to host the show. I'd also like to thank Daniel for being here. We were chatting in the studio just moments ago and learned, Daniel, I don't know if I had known this, but asking about your name, my last name being Fransson, Sanderson, having that same Northern European, Scandinavian feel to it. But Daniel, I just learned or was reminded that you were adopted. And I was about to ask about if you had ever done 23andMe and how that has affected you perhaps in your view of life, in your analysis of why we are here on Earth and what our purpose is.
Well, the 23andMe, as far as I know, would provide me a lot more information that I don't already have. I did participate in a National Geographic DNA test, and that study is no longer being conducted by National Geographic. They retired the study, and the results from the study basically gave a genetic background of percentages, and I think a certain percent of Neanderthal and like long prehistory kind of stuff, nothing relatively recent, nothing that generationally I would be able to identify with. I'm fascinated in that type of thing. To do something like a 23andMe, that would be fascinating. I never knew or don't know my biological father, so that would be interesting. I don't know if I could ever correlate that or uncover.
Well, you could. I just not to shill for them right now. I should perhaps request some remuneration for doing so, but I can't actually remember if it was 23andMe that I did or a similar one. But I get these pings that say, a close relative has been identified. So you would absolutely become connected to those who are close relatives of you as they begin to not map the genome, but map the DNA footprint of recent history and that older history. So, to the degree that you're curious, that would be an avenue for you to pursue. But you'd mentioned North American Indian connection there as well, which might be an interesting tie-in for today's show as we get into it.
Yeah, there's a 16th Cree Indian background, and one of the, I guess, more famous connections that listeners might be aware of if they were hockey fans. There was a dynasty of hockey players that kind of ruled the NHL prior to the Edmonton Oilers in the early 80s, and this would have been the New York Islanders. One of the superstars from the New York Islanders was Brian Trottier, and he has the same biological background as I do, and Cree ancestry. And so for him, that actually allowed him to play for United States and for Canada in the, I guess, the international competitions, right? When you had Team Canada or Team USA, he was able to do both. And he's a Hockey Hall of Famer, so that's something that our family is proud of. And an interesting part of, an interesting part of family history. So
I think I've shared that during my time in Sweden, I became very much in tune with the geopolitical hockey war ideologically between the Soviet Union, Canada, America. I think I might have Sweden. I might have gotten into that last time. But the Cree. So where were they actually geographically? More specifically, for those who don't know, like myself.
Well, they're a Plains Indian, and so they're going to be in Alberta and Saskatchewan, which and that goes down into the United States as well. I guess Idaho and Montana, this kind of directly down from Alberta, you probably see that type of thing. But yeah, they're a Cree background, Plains Indian, so they were known for, and still are, for the big headdresses of feathers and such. So that's interesting. There's probably a little bit of trauma with the family in the background, with some of the residential things that are becoming more and more, I guess, coming to light socially. And maybe that's a point to have a discussion about the theological imposing on cultures so far as which could actually be described as genocidal, and that's obviously a position that some people in society today take, and I think that's a hard one for the church to negotiate.
Would absolutely love to get into that. In fact, I was just looking on a map because my family and I drove back today from Mackinac Island. We'll get into why it's spelled Mackinac versus Mackinac, which is Mackinac City, here in a minute, because it ties into this discussion. Mackinac Island is very northern Michigan, just south of the border of Ontario. And so I don't assume that the Cree would have been that far east, possibly. It's not necessarily plains, that's Great Lakes, but there would have been other Indian tribes there. And I did not know until we spent 3 days on this island the degree to which North American history played out right there on Mackinac Island. And the reason Mackinac Island is spelled with a C at the end, Mackinac, I learned, is because the French named it that based on that's how they would spell Mackinac. And then Mackinac City was spelled the English way because the Americans who were speaking English, they were not Americans at the time. Today we would call them Americans, but the British and the French, were vying for domination of this new land, and had varying approaches and alliances with the various Indian tribes at various times during that time as history unfolded. And it was quite fascinating to be there and dive into a little bit of this history. Of course, the nature of history, it's commonly known, is that it gets written by the victors. So you always bring a little bit of skepticism to what you read about history, and historians dive deeper into that as to what was actually going on. And so I think probably not today, because I want to go further back in history.
Okay.
But I want to definitely get to that point of the point that you raised about the whole missionary. We actually stayed in what was it called, Mission Point Resort or something like that. And guess what? It was called a mission because they were seeking to convert the Indians, if you will. But they also, according to the history on the island, did so in a very, what can I say, to them, altruistic way, in that they were bringing, medicine and other what they thought were European cultural benefits to those tribes in that way. And of course, this is history written by the victors, like I said. But there was always that ideal, right, of not, and of course, forced conversions did happen. But there was at least a professed intent to improve the lives of these people.
Mm-hmm.
But to your point, certainly eradicating culture and even genocide resulted from it, no doubt. But going back a little further in history, I would like to play two short videos for you and for our audience today. The first one is, they're both from the Bible Project, which is completely independent from us. We have nothing to do with it. It's a Christian organization that does these great little animated videos. Great because they so quickly summarize what's going on in those early biblical accounts. In the book of Genesis, the creation story. The title of the show, for those who don't know, since our host Alex didn't mention it, is Created in the Image of God, the Role of Religion in Society. And I'm here with Daniel Sanderson talking about this from two perspectives, the biblical theological perspective, which I represent, and Daniel bringing a fact-based, evidence-based approach using philosophy and history, as well as other things that he brings to the discussion. So the purpose of showing these videos is to lay the groundwork of where I'm coming from in this show, and then have Daniel's perspective added onto that. And I think it neatly encapsulates where we're going right now, which is, where does authority come from to form governments? Where does authority come from, supposedly, to travel from one part of the world historically and come to another, and then seek to educate those peoples that were found on the so-called North American continent, and some of the topics that Daniel just teed up there. So without further ado, let me just quickly tee up the first video. We'll try to play exactly 3.18 seconds of this from the Bible Project.
The book of Genesis is the first book of the Bible, and its storyline divides into two main parts. There's chapters 1 through 11, which tell the story of God and the whole world. And then there's chapters 12 through 50, which zoom in and tell the story of God and just one man, Abraham, and then his family. And these two parts are connected by a hinge story at the beginning of chapter 12. And this design, it gives us a clue to how to understand the message of the book as a whole and how it introduces the story of the whole Bible. So the book begins with God taking the disorder and the darkness described in the second sentence of the Bible.
And Daniel, just to confirm, you can hear the audio, right?
Yep.
My cat, my daughter's cat, just jumped in my lap just as I was trying to get that arranged, and I wasn't sure I had done it right. Sorry.
And God brings out of it order and beauty and goodness. He makes a world where life can flourish. And God makes these creatures called humans, or Adam in Hebrew. He makes them in his image, which has to do with their role and purpose in God's world. So the humans are made to be reflections of God's character out into the world, and they're appointed as God's representatives to rule his world on his behalf, which in context means to harness all of its potential, to care for it, and make it a place where even more life can flourish. God blesses the humans. It's a key word in this book. And he gives them a garden. It's like a place from which they begin starting to build this new world. Now, the key is that the humans have a choice about how they're going to go about building this world. And that's represented by the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Up till now, God has provided and defined what is good and what is not good. But now God is giving the humans the dignity and the freedom of a choice. Are they going to trust God's definition of good and evil, or are they going to seize autonomy and define good and evil for themselves? And the stakes are really high. To rebel against God is to embrace.
So let's just pause there for a moment, Daniel. A lot of ground covered there. Not sure if we dove into this particular question, but that's the basic theological premise of the book known as the Bible, a collection of 66 books. We're in the Old Testament, the first book called Genesis, which is origins or beginning. And lays the stage that God is the creator of good, and basically giving humans a handbook and an offer of joy and eternal life, but then saying, look, you can choose. You have a choice, free will. What's your thought or comment on this so far? Anything you want to throw out there? Any foundation you want to lay from your perspective for this discussion?
Well, I'm a lot closer to your perspective than listeners might think. In some respect, it would be interesting if we could have like kind of a fist-to-fist mental sort of back and forth. But I think for me, it's just a simple reversal that God came from goodness, not the other way around. And so effectively...
So you're telling me that you actually do believe in some kind of higher power or directional or source or directional magnet, or how would you describe the word that you just used, God?
Well, first of all, I take one of the O's out, and I'd call it good. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a fundamental underlying ethic in humans, and I think that is effectively what Plato was trying to do, was describe our ability to abstract. He's describing our ability to conceive of abstract thought, and in that description, he's saying there's an ethic of goodness in there. And I think it's a point to really, really meditate on that, with whether you have a theological background or not, and really see the beauty in that ethical thread within philosophy itself. Right?
And I'm actually not trying to create division at all. I love that we have unity of thought. I think that's really more productive if you can get there. But I think it's also important to understand how that unity of thought arrives, or where there might be key differences, right? So I use the word handbook because it is my belief that greater good, that is a force or a power that is in itself conscious and has purposefully given the Bible and other sources of direct revelation, that the Bible is not merely derived from man's own sense of goodness, but it is an external input to provide guidance. And thus I would take, perhaps a little bit more literal approach than you. I'm not saying it's in any sense completely and totally literal, but nonetheless that God's creation, and for the listeners, shock of shocks, because I claim to be a fundamentalist, I do believe also in evolution. I believe God setting forth evolutionary mechanisms that man has been able to understand and uncover, that are part and parcel of how the universe was created to drive things forward. But that for human evolution, specifically this outside input in the form of direct revelation, which was recorded, came specifically with a conscious effort to educate humankind. Not that humankind, as it became aware and was educated, began to write down its own musings. So I'll throw that out there, because we recently changed the show from exploring the Bible to created in the image of God, but I want the listeners to know where I come from in terms of, I do believe that there's a direct revelation and an authority and a power in those words that may or may not be a difference that we have. I'm curious as to your approach on that.
Well, revelation is a really interesting word, because it's it fundamentally means a revealing, and so this is something that Plato describes as like it's out there. The information is out there, and we reveal it. And there's certain people that can maybe reveal it better than others. And how are those revealed? Are they revealed through virtuous acts, reason, some of the higher powers that we've been endowed with. I think that is the case. And I think when we look at the poetry of the language, and we look at the meaning behind words like revelation, or goodness, or virtues, I think we can see a beauty in itself. We can see an ordered arrangement that, in your words, you'd said that it comes from a higher power. And so, how would I describe that higher power if I'm continuing to, pull along this thought thread? That higher power would be what we would describe as a eusocial species. There's something in itself that happens in a group, a force, if you will, right? That no one man would be able to accomplish what we naturally accomplish in a group. Okay, and I think that's where you could say something like the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, right?
Well, that's a topic I'd really like to dive into as we move forward in this. We're right now at the point of, in the story here, and for those who don't know it, the fact that there's the representation here of a male and a female. We skipped over the part in this representation of where God presents the animals to Adam, and he is looking for someone as a helper for him. And I believe that the text shows that it's because he had been given this task, which was to dress and keep the garden. And amongst the animals, there were those who could help him with that to some degree. Man has domesticated animals for good purposes, and sometimes with not so good intent. But still, there was nothing found there that was suitable on his level, right? And he probably also noticed that there were male and female animals, and that they could, bring forth offspring. And so the biblical story goes, that's when Eve was introduced, and you see them here holding hands side by side. The intent is they should work together to carry out God's purpose, and then they're given a new commandment, which supersedes the previous one without intending to abolish the previous one, which is to be fruitful and multiply. And therein immediately lies the rub, as we'll get into here in a second. When they make this choice, do they become that eusocial species that you describe, or do they become the most invasive species that the world has ever seen and begin to dominate the planet in a negative way, ultimately destroying their own habitat? Right?
But wait a minute, I have to put my hand up. The eusocial does not mean that, does not imply anything ethical, right? I mean, you could have a completely destructive species that functions in a eusocial way. So just to clarify that.
Got it. Thank you. Yeah. Important clarification. So, in other words, that eusocial species has greater power for good or evil, positive or destructive, to put it in less stark terms.
Yeah.
Constructive or destructive, right? So yeah, great. So that would tie in line with this story exactly, because now they have the power to procreate, and then they're given this choice. So unless you've got another comment, let's just continue through the end of this.
I would say something about the male and female, and the thing about
Sure.
a theological description is it makes the listener feel like all of a sudden ex nihilo, right? Out of nothing popped
Right.
a female, right? As if
Right.
it's like we just added the character in the story. Now I'm saying that in kind of like a negative way or a condescending way, but if I said it in a beautiful way, to say that the man actually became aware of its other counterpart. We could talk about logos and recorded word and all this type of thing, but that's how I see it coming into existence from out of nothing.
Yep.
As opposed to all of a sudden, some sort of magic wand went boop, and now there's a woman there, right? And And I think that's an important thing to point out to people, that how it actually comes about in the minds of the image of God, as you would refer to it, right?
Awesome. And I have to ask a question now. I don't know that I've ever asked you this. You don't, but I believe I know the answer, but I want to ask very pointedly. You don't have any specific theological affinity, or certainly not affiliation, right? Because I'm about to share something from one particular theological perspective that gets at this point that you just raised. And I'm glad you raised it, so that when I raise it, this wasn't in any kind of plant for me to make this point, but I just wanted to confirm you're not, this is just coming from your fact-based philosophical studies, analysis, and intuitive discernment, or have you read about this from some source, this particular question?
Well, I
approach?
wouldn't honestly, Wade. I wouldn't honestly. I know this show is, really focused on the fact-based approach. I don't know if in the spirit of this conversation, whether that's as important as the beauty of the conversation. And for listeners, I was pulled into more of a spiritual conversation around somewhere between 2012 and 2016, and I was pulled into the New Atheists. This would be the Hitchens, Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, this kind of thing. And when I was pulled into this was kind of the zenith of the point of understanding, oh, well, of course I'm an atheist. I mean, how is that? I'd have no problem identifying that way. Since 2016 and uncovering more and studying more philosophy, I do it from a standpoint of trying to understand the theological position, try and feel the empathy of the position. And so much beauty is revealed, Wade, when you can really understand where this stuff came from, the significance of it, and the beauty of it. And so I'm a lover of it in that sense. So it's a unique position to have.
Absolutely. So Sam Harris, for those who may know who he is in particular, to pull out one of those people you mentioned, is sometimes viewed as being somewhat anti-religious. He is portrayed in that manner. Having read his book, The End of Faith, I certainly understand where those people come from. So your particular review encounter with Sam Harris, it almost sounds like you maybe went in a little bit of a different direction. Am I misunderstanding that?
No, I think he used it as a foundation. The launching pad of the four horsemen, as they like to call them, were against the madness of religion. I think the one person to point to who would be really against religion would have been Christopher Hitchens, who wrote the book God is Not Great, and how religion poisons everything. This is his fundamental premise.
Right.
And I think I think the most coherent observation that I've been able to hear come out of that phase, I guess, of society was that it actually started to breed almost a cult in itself. Right. And I think this
interesting
leads into
observation. Thank you.
in your point of where does that authority come from?
Yeah.
Do we bow down to a new liberal order, or do we bow down to a new emerging new atheist movement, or do we put our faith in a longer lineage of wisdom that is anchored in books like the Bible?
Awesome. Thank you so much. So the perspective I wanted to share actually comes from the Baha'i faith. And for listeners, I identify as a Baha'i, despite being a former Christian minister who holds to the truth and values that I discovered from the Bible. I do believe that the Bible is the Word of God. I believe that it's God-breathed. And I test and challenge everything I come across, whether from a religious perspective or the secular world, in the pages of the Bible. I trust the Bible implicitly. But the Baha'i perspective on this story is that there are many, many symbolic interpretations that are possible, to your point about goodness, and that we should be looking at it and exploring those. But the one that is specifically called out is that Eve is symbolic of man's soul, and that what you said would actually align with that, which is why I had to ask, in that he became aware that the woman was in fact an equal partner in the project that he was beginning to understand. And as that awareness came, a choice arose, which we will now get to in this video, unless you have further comments on that.
Death, because you're turning away from the giver of life himself. This is represented by the tree of life. And so in chapter 3, a mysterious figure, a snake, enters into the story. The snake's given no introduction other than it's a creature that God made. And it becomes clear that it's a creature in rebellion against God, and it wants to lead the humans into rebellion and their death. The snake tells a different story about the tree and the choice. It says that seizing the knowledge of good and evil are not going to bring death, that it's actually the way to life and becoming like God themselves. Now, the irony of this is tragic, because we know the humans, they're already like God. They were made to reflect God's image. But instead of trusting God, the humans seize autonomy, they take the knowledge of good and evil for themselves, and in an instant, the whole story spirals out of control. The first casualty is human relationships. The man and the woman, they suddenly realize how vulnerable they are. Now, they can't even trust each other. And so they make clothes and they hide their bodies from one another. The second casualty is that intimacy between God and the humans is lost. So they go and run and hide from God, and then when God finds them, they start this game of blame shifting about who rebelled first. Now, right here, the story stops, and there's a series of short poems where God declares to the snake and then to the humans the tragic consequences of their actions. God first tells the
we lost Daniel, but I found him again. So I'm not sure if I somehow booted you out, Daniel, but welcome back. I assume you were able to hear most of that. So This is where I wanted to stop this portion, this video. We'll make a giant leap from here in a minute to the second video.
Damn, I was enjoying it.
Well,
I know, that's fine.
Yeah. Well, it now gets more into the theological, which I really don't want to go deep into, who the snake symbolizes. We know it symbolizes the devil in Christian thought. The devil emerges later and in a very vague way in the Bible. So you have to go back and anachronistically pin the devil label on the serpent. It is interesting, though, as I like to point out, because later in the book of Revelation you have the dragon, which is the serpent all grown up, which is when the evolution of Adam and Eve results in a society, and they give political power and authority to the negative aspects of this autonomy. Now the serpent that can only whisper in this story becomes a dragon with the power to destroy and kill, right? That's how the arc, in my opinion, of the Bible, if you want to jump all the way forward to Revelation, comes around. But along the way, we're gonna explore more this idea of the image of God and the idea of authority and rulership and who gets to decide in a community, right? As they sit here and blame shift, she started it, and we won't get into the poems here too much. I could go on and on and on. One of my curses is that I am a former minister who used to give, these epic 75 to 90-minute sermons, and I'll try to avoid that here. And jump back over to you for your thoughts and comments on what we've just seen, and in particular this choice, this autonomy. And, was God surprised by this, or was this part of the path to goodness all along?
I'm gonna need a little bit more help on that one, because was God surprised by this? Yeah, let's talk about that for a minute. Was God surprised by that?
Well, in the story, it's almost like, well, I'm surprised you made that choice. You made the wrong choice. Maybe that's a better way to put it. Is God now? Maybe he wasn't surprised, but maybe he knew. It's like, darn it, I figured they'd probably make the wrong choice, and now he has to deal with it, right? He has to react. Is God reacting now to a bad choice? Or was it his plan all along that, there's no other way? There's no other way for this species, for this creation to grow and mature and to evolve, but for them to have autonomy and begin making bad choices along with good choices. And is a bad choice ultimately really bad?
Well, I mean, one of the things to look at with the problem of evil is it's implicitly defined by goodness. So can you have goodness without having evil?
Exactly.
I mean, how do you know what is good if you don't know? I mean, I'm not saying it's an implicit sort of statement that every act of goodness is defined by something bad, but it does have a sharpening mechanism to it, and if it brings it to the light, so to speak. So all of the metaphors are just priming, ready to come out, ready to explode, and we're kind of built that way.
It's a pregnant moment.
There we go, pregnant, in the light, yeah.
Well, cool. So we can come back to this at some point. But I want to keep this going now so that we don't spend too much time on Adam and Eve, and we get to where we ended up last time, which is the questions facing human society today, as particularly manifested in the nation that I reside in. For those who weren't here last week, both Daniel and I were born in Canada, but I fled, escaped, migrated, or was lost, depending how you look at it, by becoming an American, i.e. a U.S. citizen and living in the United States of America, which increasingly is looking more like the divided states of America. And we're going to get into what's going on here and the choices that we have as a nation and as a society, and how those choices are being made today and defined by our courts. So this next video, also from the Bible Project, as I mentioned, talks about that idea of establishing authority and rulership for human society, not just a man and a woman and their family and a tribe, but as this thing grows and you get larger groups of people who need to organize themselves in some fashion and decide who's going to be in charge and how. I think I might have done that the wrong way. Let me give another try here. This video is from the Bible Project, and it's called, surprisingly, Image of God.
So if you lived in ancient Bible times, odds are you lived under the authority of a king.
And many of these kings claimed that they were gods, and they would even call themselves the image of God.
Meaning they had authority to tell people what to do, order things to be made.
Yeah, they got to define good and evil. And these kings would often make statues of themselves, which in Hebrew were called tselem, often translated as idol or image.
But for Israel, they didn't view their kings as the god. In fact, they were never supposed to even make images of God.
It's exactly right, and that was really unique for that time and culture. This is rooted, first of all, in Israel's belief that you can't reduce the creator God down to any one thing in creation. But there's another reason. People aren't to make images of God because God has already made images of himself.
When did he do that?
Well, let's go to page 1 of the Bible. And the first person we meet there is God. He's the one with authority over all creation. He speaks and creation obeys, and he defines what is good and not good. In other words, he alone is king. But then surprisingly, as the pinnacle of all of God's creative work, he makes humans, and he calls all of them the image of God.
So he gives all humans the authority to rule.
Exactly, that's what he goes on to say. He tells the humans to subdue the earth and to rule it. And so this task that once belonged only to elite kings is here in the Bible the task of every human being. This was a revolutionary statement in its day because all humans are being called to rule and to participate in the human project.
So what does this mean? I mean, how are we all supposed to rule?
So the picture we get in Genesis is gardening.
Gardening?
Yes, gardening. So they rule the earth by cultivating it, by harnessing all of the earth's raw potential and then making something more and new out of it.
So growing food for each other.
Yes, but that also includes growing families then, which become neighborhoods, and then they create communities where people are going to work and take care of each other and build businesses and cities that will expand to new places and so on.
So ruling is really the day-to-day acts of our work and creativity.
Yes, we take the world somewhere. This is humanity's divine and sacred task.
Yeah, and this all sounds really nice. And humans have designed some pretty great things. But just as often we create things that cause a lot of suffering and a lot of injustice. So maybe we shouldn't actually be ruling.
Yeah.
And I will pause it there with that equally pregnant question. And kind of brings it back to this question, right? Pregnant in this big choice and what's about to unfold and the authority that we have. And who should rule? Should anybody be ruling? You know, there are anarchists and there are libertarians. There are all kinds of philosophies today around the idea of governments and rulerships. Daniel Sanderson, what do you say to all this?
This is where philosophy breaks down, my friend. It really does. Plato, for me, was somebody that got. He was such an amazing thinker. He really was, and Socrates as well. I mean, Aristotle and that whole tradition, the whole society in itself, was really contributed to that birth of humanity.
Well, and is the fate of Socrates another example of what you just said, where philosophy breaks down? I remember reading I.F. Stone's The Trial of Socrates and being incredibly impressed with that. And his, I don't know if you're familiar with that book, but that's you know, I have none of the credentials that you have in terms of study, but that one book really kind of opened my eyes on a perspective of, you know, negative dialectics and how Socrates failed in the eyes of I.F. Stone to actually produce actionable results, and rather than commit, he chose death. Now, you may have a completely different view of that book if you read it, but
I haven't actually, but it is held by academics as a really important piece of academic literature. I know. For me, it's interesting. I'm doing a large project where I'm going back into the dialogues and creating animations, responses, building and creating from the actual dialogues themselves. I think the creative process is much different than the critical process, right? It's very easy,
absolutely,
to take a dialogue, the Bible even. You've heard the prompt when you're reading the Bible to write in the margins, right?
Right.
Yeah. Explore
the best thing you can write in the margins is a question mark, by the way.
Yes. Well, there we go. See how this is overlapping with a lot of the real value of philosophy. You know, turning hubris into humility, right? This type of approach.
Amen.
Right. And so I think that's a great starting point, rather than, because we think about, like, where does authority come from? Well, one of the starting points is don't think that you you have the authority.
That you are it.
That's right. Yeah. So.
And you are. Guess what? You have sovereignty, and this is one of my points. I will state this emphatically. I come by some of this legitimately by placing those question marks in the margins of the Bible. And when my marriage seriously began to fail, that's when humility, a new level of humility, entered in for me. And I, because of where I came from, I didn't blame God, but I looked to God for answers. Like, I've been trying to follow your formulas. So why is my marriage failing? Right? And I've been extremely diligent. I held myself in high esteem in my willingness to submit my will to the will of God as I understood it. And so I went to the page of the Bible to try to understand where I was going wrong. And it was this idea of authority where I had this false view of what it means for the husband to be the head of the wife from Paul's writings. And even though I knew that what Paul says is the husband is the head of the wife, even as Jesus is the head of the church, who sacrificed himself and gave himself for it, right? But there was still this aspect of, well, and maybe I'm a martyr in my relationship in that I have to pour myself out every day in service and love. But that still puts me in sort of a leadership role above the woman, right? And in my mind. So I went back to the book of Genesis and I started looking for, well, where does authority come from? What was God's original intent? And I began to look at these statements of Jesus that say, from the beginning of the world, it was not so. That's why my second book is called The Hardness of the Heart, because Jesus said, Moses allowed divorce because of the hardness of your heart, but from the beginning it was not so. And other statements of Jesus, like from the foundation of the world, which is the cosmos, from the foundation of human society. So I went back and I looked and I came to what these Bible Project guys have also shown, which is that God is the ultimate authority, and he gives this sovereignty to humankind individually, right? And then he puts the first time the word rule is used in the Bible from an authority perspective is he vested authority in the greater and lesser lights in heaven. The sun and the moon have authority, and man's sovereignty extended up to that. In other words, we submit ourselves to the light. We submit ourselves to the light, and when we do, we have sovereignty over ourselves. And that light can inform our actions, right? The choice that each of us make as an individual every day about what is good and evil. But that authority doesn't extend to other humans. Our sovereignty extends over ourselves and over all of creation, but the male and female, the man and the woman, the two beings in the story, neither of them have authority over the other. Those ideas begin to enter in after they begin to make questionable choices. Sorry for a long-winded,
I have something really interesting to ask you. Something fascinating about the woman that I think you're going to give a beautiful response to, right? Because
I would hope. I might also stick my foot deeply into my mouth and down my throat, but go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So one thing that I really and by the way, that did come across as a bit of flattery, right? And so the Greeks would call that sophistry. So we'll just call that we just put it forefront out there and realize hopefully that we can detach that from any kind of emergent phenomenon or knowledge that might surface here. But I've been very intrigued with the Greek tradition, and I do find that there is a bit of a male emphasis in there, right? However, that may or may not be true. It may not be as true as we tend to perceive it. And I thought it was really interesting that early on in this discussion, you had said something about the female representing the soul and using words like cultivation. And I guess, can I form this in any kind of form of a question? Would you feel that it's a worthwhile discovery or revelation to describe the female in more of a matriarchal position versus how we, I guess, view the male-female dichotomy the way it is right now? It's a hard question because I don't know if you've really got the question in it, but I feel that the project of human understanding seems to be insufficiently representing the wisdom of the female form and value in society. What would you say to that?
Anything I could say would just be woefully inadequate and insufficient, right? I would just make a couple of comments off the cuff, which are, one area that I've pondered is that of the two, the woman is the one that does all the work of creation, right? She is the one that brings forth the one who will make mention of God and carry forth the species. She is the one that provides everything for that emerging life. In that sense, man provides a spark and a moment of conception. But he's one of two components there, right? And who knows exactly how that works? I'm not a biologist, and I mean that without any sarcasm. But the woman is the one who's bringing forth the life, doing all the work, providing everything, who's having to nurture that nascent life right from the very beginning. And this is coming from somebody who has had many health challenges that go way back to the fact that I didn't necessarily have a mother who was capable. And perhaps you and I are similar in that way. Who knows all the circumstances around the adoption, but a mother who wasn't really capable of giving that nascent life the best start. My mother suffered from alcoholism back in the day. Both my parents were smokers. My mother continued smoking throughout the pregnancy and presumably drinking, and I had many health problems growing up. So. But the female of the species makes that dramatic contribution during the gestation period. That's one thing I would mention, and as such, would bring an enormous perspective to the human project, right? And that's just the tip of the iceberg.
Mm.
Well, and interestingly, some of the issues that I have with where society is going today, in the ideas of supposed enlightenment and tolerance and the progressive nature of some of the decisions that are being made by society today around gender, cause me great concern. I'm not going to go there. I don't want this to become, that kind of a program, but I have concerns about that, and upholding used to be that the female of the species certainly was concerned about equality and not having empowerment and whatnot, but today's approach seems to me to be a greater threat to that than anything that was going on 100 years ago. Just my own opinion. It's in evidence in the sports world as again as a very small minor tip of the iceberg, but enough said on that. So I don't know if I remotely did what you had hoped in providing some kind of elevation of our view of women.
Do you feel that the woman as our biological pair provides more of an orderly function? If you were to compare male female, would you say that the female provides more order and structure?
Not necessarily, and but that's going to be in the definition of the word order, right?
Mm.
I think the testosterone based being is out there creating order out of chaos in our own way, right? And has throughout human history. Going out and slaying the saber-toothed tiger and other wild beasts that threatened the order of the camp, right?
Yeah.
But they're each. I mean, so they're the two wings of one bird, right? And the bird can't fly without these two. And testosterone and estrogen are ways in which I like to describe this, because they're different and they achieve different things biologically, and they're a reality that cannot be just wished away or affirmed away, right? I have a really serious issue with the term gender affirmative, or that.
Wade,
Yeah.
you're bringing it back in.
Well, I don't think you can ignore it completely, right?
Yeah.
What is gender affirming, right? Well, there's testosterone and there's estrogen.
Are we going to cross that line, Wade?
I'm not afraid of it.
No, either am I. But
I'm absolutely not afraid of it. I just don't want to make the show about it. But if you're
Right.
asking me about describing a woman, I don't know how else to do it except to step on those triggers.
Well, I mean, you could stay very throughout evolutionary history, for a lineage or reproduction or the continuation of our species, we need a male and we need a female.
Yeah. Right.
Very simple.
Well,
right?
but
Natural law.
medical science and humankind is beginning to exercise its sovereignty to meddle with that, like many other things. And again, morality, ethics, where does that line? When and how has humanity crossed the line? I love this topic because to me it goes back to the Tower of Babel, which is, I mentioned that the two lights and the tower to heaven, which would seek to assert our sovereignty above that of the greater and lesser lights, right? And the symbolism of the tower to heaven is exactly that, in the same way that in the book of Isaiah, you have this being called Lucifer, who's the light bringer, who says, I will ascend to heaven and become like the Most High. So it's that idea of, where and when are we exercising legitimate free choice, and when have we crossed a line? And I believe that tinkering with gender violates this principle that is also described in the Bible, that the pot does not get to ask the potter, why have you made me thus?
Yeah, right. That's right. Where the child doesn't get to ask, in the concentration camp, why was I born? That's it's kind of a weird way to think about it.
Richard Frankel is another one of those seminal books, Man's Search for Meaning.
Yeah.
Powerful, right? I assume you've read that one, or is that
Yeah.
another one of the few that I've read that somehow, I don't know.
Yeah, so that's a very interesting topic. We're thrust into this world and we don't have a choice with that. There's a certain amount of determinism that's forcing us into existence, and the culture has a real shaping function to that. So I can simultaneously in one breath say that I have a choice, but I can also say that I don't have a choice if I'm a believing Christian, right? Now there's
especially if we get into the topic of predestination, right?
Well, but there's a counter argument to that says, this is the natural order and the law of God and goodness, so that you can't say that you have a choice towards something that is just a natural law of the universe, right? I wanted to ask you a question about the shaping function of the church and how religion as a whole, how it changes over time. So the Bible basically came into existence 1,500 to 2,000 years ago, depending on who you talk to. I say that just so that we can agree on it. We don't have to really, go back and forth on this. But when
certainly the canon, right? The canon, canon, which is the version that we have that the Catholic Church established as the official. But of course, before that, you have what I like to refer to as the church in the wilderness, right?
That's
not actually that's problematic in other ways. Certainly, that I used to view it that way. I have to think about that. I'm dredging up now an old term, but under Moses, right? You really have sort of the first indication of a church in the Bible. I mean, when do you have a church in the Bible? And in the New Testament, the word for church is ecclesia. At least it's one of them in Greek, right? And it really just means the body of believers. So church and religion are terms that I believe, yes, those are not divinely revealed, right? Those are constructs by the people who are seeking to pursue that ideal and doing so in a variety of ways, some good, some bad. You have this situation in ancient Israel where Israel wanted a king, right? We saw in this Image of God video that Israel didn't have a king and it was against their theology. This is clearly documented in that God gave them a king almost to spite them. He warned them, look, I'll give you a king, because they wanted to be like the nations around them. And here's what's going to happen. Similarly to the curses in the book of Genesis, where God tells Adam and Eve, you want to go that way? Here's what's going to happen. And these poems are curses, right? They come across as curses. Whereas, in fact, God is just describing the consequences of that choice in advance. You want to make that, it's kind of like a parent saying, you know what, I'm giving you the car keys, but, if you go out tonight and it's snowing and you're going to go to that party, here's what I predict is going to happen on the way home, right? And so God gives Israel a king, and then later he gives them a second king, which is King David. And King David is a man after God's own heart, whereas the first king is kind of the king that the people wanted, Saul, right? But even so, very clearly, there wasn't supposed to be a king at all, and even King David wasn't supposed to happen. But then you made that choice, and now you're down that path, and Anyway, so I forget how I kind of got off on that. You prompted that in some way.
Well, you've got to live with it, and you've got to and it's got a shaping function. The question that I wanted to ask is, could you speculate, even just like come up with an idea of what a the form of religious thought and belief would be in 5,000 years, right? So you kind of think about that for a second, and then say what could it or should it be in 50,000 years, and in 500,000 years.
Let me full disclaimer. I'm not a prophet of any kind, not even with a small p, right?
Yeah.
And I claim zero authority, zero divine insight. I am a student, and I do put those question marks. But it's a question I've actually thought about a lot. And I can speculate because I believe that the Bible, the source of revelation, points in that direction, right? Here's what I would say about that. There are two great books of Revelation. One is the one I talked about earlier, which is that direct revelation where God specifically told Adam and Eve stuff. And he later told Moses stuff. He told Abraham stuff. He told Noah stuff. God, in some form, literally appeared and provided information that was revealed, that was not discerned, but given. And this was written down and recorded, I believe, somewhat earlier than the time you put. I believe that the Old Testament was compiled under King David. That's my personal belief. I won't get into why. From a scholarly perspective, I hold that view. And the editors redacted and combined material at that time from previous oral history and fragments, and but going forward, What is predicted is in evidence, and this gets why I want to talk about North America. And by the way, I know we're over time, but I'm going to just kind of try to crash land this plane right now without destroying everybody in it. And that is that the American project, in my opinion, is a further continuation of what God wanted to do with Moses and Israel on that city on a hill, that bright, shining city on a hill that shows the way forward for humankind. And the American federated system of voluntary delegation of some sovereignty by the states, by the nations, by the democratically elected governments, by the kings that the people wanted, right? That authority was given over to a degree to a federated power. That is the future of humankind. And so the emerging League of Nations and United Nations, which are a bugbear, right? A horrible evil in the minds of many fundamentalists, of which I am one, because of what the book of Revelation describes that dragon power will do when human society gains enough power and capabilities through unity to give power to entities that will behave the way kings of old have behaved and will wreak greater havoc than ever heretofore. And it is nonetheless a painful path forward in which we must give up some of our individual sovereignty, just like a husband and wife. The joke there is that the husband being the head of the wife, that means that I get to make any major decision, and I'll let my wife make all the minor decisions, and that works really well so long as there's never a major decision to be made, right? So long as you recognize that you're not in charge of anything. But this is a cooperative, consultative team approach in which we make decisions together. We provide our input, we listen to each other, and we reach common ground. In theory, a husband and wife can do that, and even a family. We as a family try to do that. We try to consult and make decisions as a family now that my kids are 11 and 14. And at the tribal level, at the national level, but now we're at a federated level, right? And so we have the United Nations, which is our nascent attempt to do this and is pointing the way forward to cooperative unity as a species. All races, all tribes, including all different ideologies and opinions and perspectives that have to be allowed, because those people who believe differently from myself were also created in the image of God. And I have no right to force convert them or even seek to convert them. That's God's business, not mine, right? But I have to sort of circle back. Now, that's so 5,000 years, all these different perspectives, some form of unity, some form of cooperation where we become enlightened and further enlightened to approach that. Going even further into the future, this is where the second book of Revelation, forget about now the divinely revealed Word of God in written form. The greater creation, or the greater revelation, is the creation itself. We are only now beginning to learn how to read that book. Since the Enlightenment, we were given the ability to begin to truly understand creation itself, to explore its mysteries. God built his revelation into the creation, and the more we study scientifically and with full rational thought and awareness and detachment from religious ideology and dogma, this is where again you and I probably align, where we realize that whatever religious beliefs I have, they're probably corrupt, they're probably flawed, they're probably not as pure, right, or good as I think they are, despite basing them on this other revelation. This scientific exploration of the creation itself should help us draw closer to God, and as a species then continue to master the domain which has, since the Tower of Babel, in my opinion, the governor was taken off. We have been allowed to ascend above the clouds to build that tower to heaven. And again, the space race between the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and the United States of America, it was all about that, in the divine order of things and the ongoing work of God and the revelation of God. I believe at some point we'll look back and understand that. And another reason why the United States is that sort of forward-looking beacon, flawed as it is, for humanity's evolution of cooperation and, ascending to the stars and ascending beyond this planet. We've been given that privilege and right. We've matured as a species beyond the governor that was put in at the Tower of Babel. And 50,000 years from now, go look at Star Trek, right? Go look at Star Wars. I do believe that we'll be moving in those directions, including, some of the governance models that are implied or explicit in those science fiction versions of, the future.
Very interesting, Wade.
What about yourself, Daniel? What do you see as the next step?
Well, I was wondering if we're doing okay on time.
We're over time, but
That's okay.
it's okay.
I see a fusion with technology, and I think there's an inevitable path forward that will make us integrate into technology even further. There quite possibly is a huge reckoning that could be coming as a result of the population crisis, 8.9 billion people that are on the planet.
I think we'll personally I think we'll solve that, but not in a good way.
Yeah, I could probably agree with that, and it's pretty horrific to think of how to solve that. And I think that's the opportunity for any God-loving Christian to actually think about how to move forward in the world and stand in the light of your Savior, right? That's what you have to
cannot
do.
ignore that first commandment, right? The second one, be fruitful and multiply. We love that one. Can't ignore that first one, dress and keep the garden.
Mm.
And on
Yeah.
that note, we'll explore that as we dive in, to what's going on here in the United States. I like that you brought in technology, right? Science, technology, our capacity to control and manipulate the physical creation, right? Is that not what technology is? And yeah, with great power comes great responsibility, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Daniel, what a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me. I do hope you'll continue to join us here for the next few weeks as we lay the foundation for this podcast on into what it can become. And friends, folks, viewers, Daniel Sanderson, founder of Planksip. Go check it out. I'm a subscriber, and I love the things that you write and the others that are publishing on that platform. Some really provocative, educational, challenging in the best possible way material, but that's written in such a way that it's easy to digest, easy to grab a hold of. And thank you so much for joining us here on Created in the Image of God, the Role of Religion in Society.
Thanks, Wade. I really appreciate it.
And everyone listening in, remember to subscribe, to like. I apologize. Some of you posted comments and questions, did not get to them today, but we will continue this discussion. And thank you so much for joining in.
I know.